5 o'clock in the afternoon, June 14th, 1800. Napoleon's army is broken. The Battle of Marengo is over. It is lost. 6,000 Austrian infantry, precise and victorious, are marching in victory columns across the ravaged plain. Their officers are already celebrating their triumph. Suddenly, appearing from the gun smoke and chaos, 400 French cavalrymen. Just 400? They face odds of nearly 15 to 1. It is suicide. But their commander, General Kellermann, sees the one gap, the one fleeting chance. He raises his heavy sabre. He gives the order to charge. Napoleon Bonaparte returned from Egypt in October 1799 to a nation that welcomed him as a saviour. But the France he found was a nation in ruins. It was a republic on the verge of total collapse. The Directory, the 5-man committee attempting to govern the country, was spectacularly corrupt, hopelessly inefficient, and universally despised by the populace. The economy was in tatters. Political factions plotted in the shadows. Worse for Napoleon personally, the glorious legacy of his first Italian campaign, the very foundation of his fame, had been entirely undone. While he had been in the deserts of Egypt, Austrian and Russian armies under the command of General Suvorov had stormed back into Italy, smashing French forces at Cassano, at Novi, at the Trebia. His conquests were gone. The sister republics he had created had vanished. The frontiers of France itself were once again threatened. He arrived not a moment too soon. Within a month, he did what he did best. He seized power. The coup of 18 Brumaire was not the clean, heroic stroke depicted in paintings. It was a messy, chaotic, and deeply uncertain affair, a desperate gamble that almost failed spectacularly. When he tried to address the legislature, he stammered, froze, and was shouted down as an outlaw, a dictator. He was saved only by his brother, Lucien Bonaparte, who dramatically ordered the palace guards to clear the hall, scattering the elected deputies at bayonet point. It was a military coup, pure and simple. The Directory was gone. In its place stood a new government, the consulate. And at its head, holding all real authority, was the 30-year-old General Bonaparte, now titled First Consul. He had the power. But he did not have security. He did not have legitimacy. His new government was a thinly veiled military dictatorship, and all of Paris knew it. The bankers who held the nation's finances were wary, demanding stability he could not yet promise. The Jacobins on the left despised him as a traitor to the true ideals of the revolution. The Royalists on the right saw him as a vulgar usurper of the Bourbon throne. He held his position not by law, not by popular mandate, and certainly not by love, but by his reputation alone. And that reputation was built entirely, exclusively, on one thing: victory. To hold France, he had to give France a victory. He needed it immediately. He needed it to be decisive. A victory so glorious, so undeniably brilliant, that it would silence all opposition, unify the nation behind him, and cement his rule. The target was obvious: Austria. The Austrian Empire was the head of the Second Coalition, the primary force that had reconquered Italy. Their armies, led by the elderly but deeply respected Baron Michael von Melas, now held all the critical fortresses in northern Italy. They were the ones who had erased his earlier triumphs. To restore his own legend, Napoleon had to defeat them on the very ground where he had first won his fame. But how? This was the central strategic problem of 1800. The Austrians held all the key Alpine passes. They held the fortresses. Their main army, numbering perhaps 100,000 men across the entire theatre, was methodically besieging the last French stronghold in Genoa, where Marshal Massena and his starving army were trapped in a desperate last stand. A frontal assault through the traditional coastal route near Nice would be a long, bloody and predictable meat grinder. Napoleon despised predictable warfare. He needed a masterstroke. He needed a move that would bypass the enemy's strength and strike at their weakness. His plan was pure, undiluted audacity. He would create a new army, officially named the Army of the Reserve, and he would march it not at the Austrians, but behind them. He would cross the one barrier they believed was truly impossible for a modern army to pass, the Great St. Bernard Pass in the High Alps. To do this, he needed two things: an army and total secrecy. He began gathering the new force at Dijon in eastern France, and then he engaged in one of the great deceptions of his career, a piece of strategic misdirection that revealed his genius for psychological warfare. He openly invited Austrian spies to review his new army. He made no secret of its existence. But the spies who came to Dijon saw only what he wanted them to see: a motley collection of perhaps 7,000 or 8,000 men. They were old veterans, invalides, pulled from military hospitals, and raw, untrained conscripts, many without proper uniforms or muskets. They looked more like a poorly organised home guard unit than a serious invasion force. The spies dutifully reported back to Vienna that the much-vaunted Army of the Reserve was a joke, a phantom, a propaganda effort by the first consul to frighten them. Baron Melas, commanding in Italy, received these reports and relaxed. He had nothing to fear from Dijon. He could safely continue his siege of Genoa. The spies were wrong. They had been completely, utterly fooled. The real Army of the Reserve, numbering closer to 50,000 or even 60,000 troops, including veteran infantry, heavy cavalry, and crucial artillery, was hidden. It was quartered in barracks and towns all across France, far from Dijon, its movements concealed, its units corresponding through coded messages. It was a ghost army, assembled piece by piece in secret, ready to move on Napoleon's signal. He had his army. He had his plan. Now he just had to march 50,000 men and 40 heavy cannons over the most formidable mountain range in Europe. He would follow the path of Hannibal. It was a move so reckless, so logistically insane, that his enemies had not even bothered to guard the pass. Baron von Melas was a professional. He was a veteran of the 7 Years' War. He understood the immutable rules of 18th century warfare, and those rules dictated that armies moved along predictable routes, supplied by predictable depots. His entire strategic attention was fixed firmly on the coast, on the Riviera, where any sane French commander would and must attack. The Alps, to his mind, were not a viable route. They were a wall, a vast frozen fortress of granite and ice that protected his northern flank. He believed the Great St. Bernard Pass was utterly impassable for a modern army, complete with its artillery and baggage trains. He was right. It was impassable. And that is exactly why Napoleon chose it. In the middle of May 1800, the Army of the Reserve began its ascent. This was not a march. It was an ordeal. 40,000 men, division after division, were funneled into a single, narrow, treacherous track, climbing into the sky. The soldiers, veterans of the Rhine and the Pyramids, found themselves in a new kind of hell. The air grew thin, sharp, and bit at their lungs. The snow was still deep at that altitude, often 5 or 6 feet. They marched through ice-flecked fog, often unable to see the man 10 feet ahead of them. They slipped on the melting ice, falling into crevasses. Horses lost their footing and tumbled into the ravines below, their screams echoing and then vanishing into the void. Men suffered snow blindness, their eyes burned by the relentless glare. Their boots, adequate for a European summer, fell apart on the jagged rocks. This was the crossing. It lasted for 6, perhaps 8 days, depending on the unit. Each day was a century of misery. But the men were not the problem. The horses were not the problem. The problem was the artillery. A modern army fights with its cannons, and Napoleon had 40 of them. These were not small mountain guns. These were heavy 8-pounders and 12-pounders, solid bronze tubes weighing thousands of pounds apiece. They could not be pulled by teams of horses up slopes too steep for a mule. So, the French engineers, led by the brilliant Marmont, improvised a solution of brute force and desperate ingenuity. The cannons were unbolted from their heavy carriages. The carriages themselves were dismantled, numbered, and strapped to the backs of mules. And the gun barrels, the very soul of the army, were laid into hollowed-out pine logs, like massive coffins, to be dragged by hand. 100 men, sometimes more, were harnessed to each log with ropes. 100 soldiers, sweating and cursing in the freezing air, pulling a single cannon, inch by agonizing inch, up thousands of feet of sheer, icy rock. They slipped. They fell. They were crushed when the rope snapped. But they did not stop. They dragged their artillery over the Alps by the strength of their own arms. History remembers this moment through the glorious dramatic propaganda of Jacques-Louis David. We see Napoleon Bonaparte, calm and heroic, rearing back on a magnificent white charger, his red cape billowing in an alpine storm. It is one of the most famous images of power ever created. It is also a complete, magnificent lie. The reality, as recorded by those who were there, was very different. The first consul did not ride a rearing stallion. He rode a mule. He was wrapped not in a heroic cape, but in a simple grey greatcoat to ward off the biting cold. He was led not by destiny, but by a local peasant guide, a 19-year-old boy named Pierre-Nicolas d'Orsaz. Napoleon, preoccupied and exhausted, apparently offered the boy money to describe his simple life, his village, his girlfriend. It was quiet. It was mundane. It was real. While Napoleon was riding his mule, his army was performing this logistical miracle. They conquered the mountain. And when the last French soldier, the last cannon, descended into the sunny plains of Piedmont, the strategic map of Europe had been redrawn. The Austrian army was still intact, but Napoleon was no longer in front of them. He was behind them. He was in their rear, sitting squarely across their lines of communication. The trap was set. While Napoleon Bonaparte was performing his logistical miracle in the high Alps, the man he intended to trap was busy conducting a war according to the established ironclad rules of 18th century combat. He was not a fool. He was the opposite of a fool. Baron Michael von Melas was a man of 70, perhaps 71 years, a grizzled veteran whose entire life had been the Austrian army. His worldview had been forged in the brutal, methodical campaigns of the 7 Years' War, a conflict that had ended more than 3 decades prior. He had served the Habsburg monarchy his entire life, rising through the ranks not through meteoric genius, but through reliability, professionalism, and a deep understanding of conventional warfare. He was a creature of logistics, of siegecraft, of slow, powerful, predictable advances. He was the old order personified, and he was winning. His army in Italy was vast, numbering somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 men across the entire theatre. This was a force of professionals. Austrian infantry, in their immaculate white coats, were renowned for their discipline and their stoic ability to endure punishment. Their cavalry was superb. Their artillery was plentiful and well served. Against this, the French armies in Italy had shattered. Melas had spent the spring methodically rolling back every gain France had made. His primary objective, the crown jewel of his campaign, was the port city of Genoa. Inside that city, Marshal André Masséna, one of France's toughest fighters, was trapped with the remnants of the French army of Italy, starving, desperate, and completely cut off by land, and by the British Royal Navy at sea. Melas knew that when Genoa fell, the war in Italy was, for all intents and purposes, over. His entire focus was on that siege. His main field army, perhaps 30,000 to 35,000 strong, was tightening the noose, while other corps guarded the mountain passes to the west, along the coast, where any sane relief attempt must come. When the first reports trickled in about French troops appearing near the Great Saint Bernard, Melas simply did not believe them. It was a strategic impossibility. He trusted his intelligence network. He knew Napoleon's Army of the Reserve at Dijon was a phantom, a pathetic bluff composed of, at most, 8,000 invalids and raw conscripts. It was a diversion. It was a theatrical gesture from a man known for such things. The real threat was elsewhere. Melas was an old fox. He had seen decades of war, and he would not be distracted from the real prize, Genoa, by this Corsican's cheap tricks. This was his fatal error. It was not a failure of intelligence, but a failure of imagination. He could not conceive of an enemy who operated outside the known rules of war. He could not imagine an opponent who would risk his entire army, his political future, everything, on a one-in-a-million gamble against geography itself. He assumed his enemy thought as he did, that his enemy respected the same constraints of weather, terrain, and logistics. By the time the horrifying truth became clear, it was too late. By the end of May, Napoleon had not just crossed the Alps. He had captured Milan. He had seized the Austrian primary supply depots. He had cut Melas's main line of communication and supply back to Vienna. In a single, brilliant, reckless move, the first consul had placed his entire army behind the Austrian main force. The hunter was now the hunted. Melas, upon realizing the extent of the disaster, was forced to make a terrible choice. He had to abandon the siege of Genoa, just as the starving city was on the verge of surrender, and frantically concentrate his scattered divisions. He gathered his forces near the fortress town of Alessandria, on the flat plains of Piedmont. He was no longer the conqueror of Italy. He was a trapped animal, cut off from home, facing an enemy who had appeared as if from the clouds. The old, methodical general was now forced to fight a desperate battle, not on his own terms, but on the terms set by this 30-year-old revolutionary who had just rewritten the rules of war. Napoleon Bonaparte was blind. He had achieved the impossible, crossing the Alps in a move of strategic genius, and now, on the very cusp of his triumph, the enemy had vanished. He was on the plains of Piedmont, sitting squarely across the Austrian supply lines. He had captured Milan. He had restored the Cisalpine Republic. But where was Melas? Where was the main Austrian army? For days his cavalry patrols had swept the countryside, finding nothing but abandoned campfires and confused rumours. The Austrian fox had gone to ground. Then, on June 13, 1800, a dispatch arrived that changed the first consul's entire calculation. Marshal Masséna, after an agonizing siege of nearly 60 days, had finally surrendered Genoa. His men, starved to the point of eating rats and boiling leather, had held on for as long as humanly possible, but they were broken. This news, a tactical defeat for France, paradoxically crystallized Napoleon's thinking. He believed it simplified the board. With Genoa fallen, Melas no longer had any reason to stay south. Surely the old Austrian must be retreating. He must be trying to escape east, back to Mantua, or north, to join his garrisons on the Po, or perhaps south, trying to link up with the Royal Navy at the coast. The one possibility that Napoleon, in his surging overconfidence, seemingly dismissed, was that the 71-year-old Austrian veteran would do the one thing Napoleon himself would do, that he would consolidate his forces and attack. This assumption was the hinge upon which history would turn. Convinced he was now in a chase, not a confrontation, Napoleon made the single greatest blunder of his campaign. He scattered his army. He weakened his centre to cover all possible escape routes, obsessed with preventing an escape, not winning a battle. This was a violation of his own most sacred military doctrine, concentration of force. But the genius was now a gambler, and he was pushing all his chips across the table. First, he dispatched a division, perhaps 6,000 men, under General Lapoap, to march north to block any Austrian attempt to cross the Po River. A logical move if the enemy was retreating north. Then he looked south. If Melas tried to reach Genoa and the sea, he had to be stopped. For this critical task, Napoleon turned to his best subordinate, General Louis Desaix. Desaix was a brilliant, aggressive commander, newly returned from the Egyptian campaign. Napoleon trusted his instincts completely. He ordered Desaix to take his division, another 5,000 to 6,000 veteran troops, and march south toward Novi, cutting the road to Genoa. Desaix obeyed. He marched away. As the sun set on June 13th, Napoleon's army was no longer a concentrated fist. It was an open hand, its fingers spread thin across 50 miles of Italian countryside. He had dispatched nearly a third of his available force on flanking missions, chasing ghosts. He himself remained on the flat, open plain of Marengo, near the fortress city of Alessandria, with the corps of Marshals Lannes and Victor. He had perhaps only 22,000 to 23,000 men and a handful of cannons. He believed he was in the perfect position to coordinate the pursuit on the following day. In reality, he had just placed himself in a deadly trap. He had done Baron von Melas's work for him, because Melas was not retreating. He was not in Genoa. He was not heading for the Po. He was right there. Just across the narrow Bormida River, hidden by the walls of Alessandria, the entire Austrian field army, numbering over 30,000 men and supported by more than 100 heavy cannons, was quietly preparing its formations. They were sharpening their bayonets. They were distributing ammunition. They were receiving their final orders for a full-scale dawn assault. Napoleon Bonaparte, the master of war, went to sleep that night convinced the campaign was already won. He was catastrophically, dangerously, fatally wrong. The dawn of June 14th broke with a thick, clinging mist over the plains around Marengo. Napoleon Bonaparte, camped at his headquarters, was impatient. He was still utterly convinced of his own genius, that Baron von Melas was in full retreat, slipping the noose he had so brilliantly laid. He expected to hear from his scouts that the Austrians were fleeing. Instead, around 9 o'clock in the morning, the heavy, damp air was torn apart by a sound that every commander dreads. It was not the scattered pop of skirmishers. It was the unified, rolling, ground-shaking thunder of massed artillery, coming not from where he expected, but from right in front of him. It was not a skirmish. It was not a rearguard. It was the coordinated thunder of more than 100 Austrian cannons opening fire simultaneously. Baron von Melas had seized the initiative. The old fox was attacking. The Austrian army, more than 30,000 strong, perhaps even 31,000, surged across the bridges of the Bormida River. They advanced not in a chaotic rush, but in 3 massive, superbly coordinated columns, their white coats pristine against the green fields, their regimental flags snapping in the morning breeze. This was the Habsburg Imperial Army at its most formidable. It was a professional 18th century military machine, slow, methodical, and utterly relentless. This was the army that had reconquered Italy, and it moved with the confidence of victors. The Austrian plan was a classic example of old-school tactics, designed by General Melas himself. It was not a plan of subtle finesse, it was a plan of overwhelming, crushing force. The main column, under General Haddock, would strike the French centre directly at the village of Marengo. A second powerful column, under General Ott, would swing to the north, enveloping the French left flank and cutting them off from any potential retreat. A third, smaller column under General O'Reilly would attack the French right flank, fixing them in place. The entire weight of the Austrian Empire was about to fall on 2 surprised French corps. The first blow struck the divisions of General Claude Victor, whose men were posted in and around the Marengo farmstead. They were caught in the worst possible posture. They were not deployed for battle. They were preparing to march, not to fight. Their muskets were stacked. Their campfires were still smoking from their morning soup. They were psychologically and physically unready for the avalanche of steel that suddenly materialized from the river mist. The surprise was absolute. Victor's men, veterans of Italy, were stunned. They scrambled for their weapons, their officers screaming at them to form a line. They fell back to their first and only line of defence, the Fontanona Creek. It was little more than a muddy ditch, perhaps 10 feet wide, but it was the only thing between them and the entire Austrian army. The fighting immediately became savage, personal, and desperate. The Austrians, enjoying a numerical superiority of at least 2 to 1 in this part of the field, simply ground the French down. Their 100 cannon systematically pounded the French positions. The old-school tactic was working perfectly. The Austrian artillery, beautifully served, tore horrific gaps in the thin blue lines of French infantry. Cannonballs smashed through the walls of the Marengo farm, turning the sturdy stone building into a slaughterhouse. Men were cut in half, the air filled with the screams of the wounded and the acrid smell of black powder. The Austrians advanced with the precision of a drill manual, halting to deliver crushing, disciplined volleys, then advancing again step by step, pushing the French back from the creek line. Victor's men held on for hours, fighting with a courage that stunned their attackers. They counterattacked. They fired volleys until their shoulders were bruised black from the recoil. They held the creek with bayonets, fighting hand to hand in the muddy water. But courage was not enough. They were being overwhelmed by sheer, relentless, methodical numbers. Marshal Lannes, positioned to the right of Victor, saw the impending collapse. Lannes was a fighter, a brawler, and he immediately threw his own corps into the fray, extending the French line and attempting to shore up Victor's crumbling flank. But Lannes too was outnumbered. He was not stopping the attack. He was merely slowing the defeat. His men were being fed into a meat grinder. The Austrian tactic was not brilliant. It was simple. It was brutal. And it was working perfectly. Melas used his superior numbers to methodically fix the French centre with unrelenting frontal pressure, all while his main column under General Ott swung wide, relentlessly pushing around the French left flank, threatening to envelop them and pin them against the river. For 4 agonizing hours, from 9 in the morning until 1 in the afternoon, the 15,000 men of Victor's and Lannes's corps did the impossible. They held back 30,000. But the cost was catastrophic. Their lines were shattered. Their companies were reduced to platoons. Their artillery was silenced, its horses killed, its crews cut down. They were, quite simply, running out of men and running out of ammunition. Napoleon, racing to the front from his headquarters, saw the disaster unfolding. He saw his men streaming back, not yet a rout, but a beaten, exhausted, bloody withdrawal. He had no reserves. He had no plan. The battle, and perhaps his entire political future, was collapsing. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the French line, which had held by sheer naked grit for more than 5 agonizing hours, was no longer bending. It was breaking. The divisions of Generals Victor and Lannes, the heroes of the morning, the men who had stood defiant against the storm, had simply ceased to exist as effective, cohesive fighting formations. They were a shattered, bleeding wreck of men, a living testament to the limits of human endurance. These were veterans, it is true. Soldiers who had followed Bonaparte to glory in his first dazzling Italian campaign, men who had famously crossed the Lodi Bridge under a hail of canister. But even veterans have a breaking point. They had been fighting hopelessly outnumbered, 2 to 1, sometimes 3 to 1 in their specific sectors, under the unceasing, methodical, soul-crushing thunder of 100 Austrian cannons. They had been doing this for hours, with no support, on empty stomachs. Their ammunition pouches were almost empty. Men fumbled for their last paper cartridges, some desperately, frantically searching the bodies of their fallen comrades, turning them over, their hands slick with their friends' blood, only to find those pouches empty as well. They began to scavenge, running from body to body, becoming targets themselves, all for one more shot. Their shoulders were bruised black and purple from the relentless, punishing recoil of their own muskets. A dull, throbbing ache that was now lost in the greater, overwhelming agony of defeat. Their faces were caked in a black mask of sweat, dust, and powder residue, their eyes white and staring, their throats raw from screaming commands that were no longer heard, and choking on the sulphurous smoke that hung over the plain like a funeral shroud. Their battalions, which had begun the day with 500 men, were now reduced to skeletal companies of 200, or 100, or in some cases just a handful of men clustered around a tattered eagle, a small, defiant island in a sea of Austrian white. Some estimates, likely conservative, suggest these frontline corps had suffered 30, perhaps even 40% casualties. The ground in front of them, especially around the stubbornly held Marengo farmstead, was a carpet of blue coats, a horrific tapestry of the dead and dying. But the Austrians in their immaculate white uniforms just kept coming. Their lines were pristine, their volleys methodical, their artillery relentless. It was the victory of the machine over the man. Napoleon, watching from his command post, could see the final, horrifying disintegration beginning. He saw his veterans, men who had never run in his presence, begin to stumble back. They were not walking. They were not marching. They were stumbling in disorganized clumps, their formations gone, their muskets held like useless sticks. He saw officers, their faces desperate, trying to rally them, grabbing men by their uniforms, threatening them with swords, pleading with them, only to be swept away themselves in the growing tide of fear. The Austrian dragoons, sensing the kill, were beginning to probe the flanks, their sabres flashing in the afternoon sun as they cut down stragglers. The first consul, the man who had gambled his entire political future on this single day, was facing the abyss. This was not just a setback. This was not a tactical withdrawal. This was annihilation, and with it, the end of his political career. He would be a footnote, the man who ruled France for 6 months. He had one last card to play, one final, desperate, hopeless throw of the dice, his final reserve, the consular guard. These were not just soldiers. These were the elite of the elite, the hardcore of his new regime, the praetorians of the consulate, 800, perhaps 900, some sources say 1,000 magnificent grenadiers in their towering bearskin hats, their brass plates gleaming. They were the granite fortress of the army, the men who guarded his person, his final guarantee of state. They had not yet fired a shot. They had watched in agonizing frustration as their comrades were slaughtered, held back by their commander for this very last moment. Napoleon gave the order. Forward. It was an act of pure desperation. It was asking less than 1,000 men to stop an entire victorious army of 30,000. It was an order for a sacrifice. The Guard advanced. They moved not at a run, but at a steady, measured, terrifying pace. They moved as if they were on the parade ground in Paris, not in the middle of a collapsing battlefield. Their drums beat the charge, that steady, hypnotic pas de charge that had unnerved so many enemies. They marched straight into the advancing Austrian centre, a small, dark blue rock against a white tidal wave. They halted. They fired a single, crashing, perfectly disciplined volley that tore a bloody hole in the Austrian front rank. Then they fixed bayonets and prepared to die. For a moment, the entire battlefield seemed to pause. The Austrians, stunned by this suicidal, magnificent display of bravado from an enemy they thought was utterly beaten, actually hesitated. The sheer, arrogant style of the advance gave them pause. But it was only a moment. The Austrian cavalry commander, his name lost to history, but his instincts sharp, saw his opportunity. Thousands of Austrian heavy dragoons, held in reserve and fresh, were unleashed. They didn't hit the Guard from the front, where the bayonets and muskets were waiting. They smashed into its flank. The square of granite shattered. The elite of the French army, the untouchables, the men who called themselves the Immortals, were overwhelmed by a sheer, brutal weight of horses and steel. They broke. They scattered. They ran, leaving their own dead and their pristine reputation on the field. This was the definitive moment. The battle was over. When the Guard broke, the army's last psychological anchor snapped. A ripple of pure, animal panic, starting with Victor's exhausted survivors and spreading instantly to Lannes's men, consumed the entire line. The withdrawal became a retreat, and the retreat, in a matter of terrifying, chaotic minutes, became a full-blown rout. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who could not lose, had lost. The entire French army, all 22,000 remaining men, dissolved. It was a scene of total, apocalyptic disaster. Soldiers threw down their heavy muskets, their packs, their shakos, anything that would slow them down. They ran for their lives, a terrified, incoherent mob streaming east across the plain, trying to escape the sabres of the Austrian cavalry that now harried their flanks, cutting them down at will. Officers were swept away with their men, their commands and threats ignored, their own faces pale with terror. Artillerymen frantically cut the traces of their horses, abandoning their precious cannons to the enemy to save themselves. The road back, the single road of retreat, was choked with a river of fleeing broken men. The greatest military mind in Europe had been completely and totally outgeneraled, outthought and outfought by a 71-year-old man he had dismissed as a geriatric fool. And on the other side of the field, at his headquarters in Alessandria, Baron Michael von Melas brushed the dust from his white uniform. He had been in the saddle all morning, personally directing the battle, and had suffered a minor contusion on his arm. He was, by his own admission, exhausted. But he had won. The battle was over. He had methodically, professionally, and completely crushed the most feared general in Europe. He had done his duty to his emperor. He had saved Italy. confident that the rest of the battle was a simple, mopping-up operation, a mere pursuit of a beaten rabble. He handed command of the victorious army to his chief of staff, General Anton von Zach. Zach's orders were simple: pursue the rabble and complete the destruction. The old baron, tired but triumphant, then rode off the field, back to Alessandria. He sat down. He began to write his victory dispatch to the imperial court in Vienna, announcing the total defeat of the first consul, the end of his army, and the spectacular, humiliating end of his Italian adventure. General Louis Desaix was at that exact moment perhaps 10 miles to the south, marching away from the battle. He was following his orders. He was marching toward Novi, chasing a phantom Austrian army that existed only in Napoleon's overconfident imagination. He was, by every measure, exactly where he was supposed to be. And it was the worst possible place he could be. His division, numbering perhaps 5,000, some sources suggest 6,000, veterans of the Army of the Orient, kicked up dust on the dry Italian road. They had been marching since dawn. It was now late morning, 11 o'clock. His men were tired. They were confused. They could hear the battle. It had begun as a distant vibration. A pulse felt through the thick soles of their marching boots, a feeling in the gut. But as the morning wore on, it had grown into a sound that defied description. It was not the pop, pop, pop of a skirmish. It was not the thump-thump of a rearguard action. It was a continuous, rolling, visceral roar. A staccato drumbeat from 100 heavy cannons, a sound that spoke only one language: total, desperate, full-scale battle. His aides-de-camp looked at each other, their faces pale with anxiety. Their written orders were explicit: proceed to Novi. To turn back without a direct command from the first consul was a career-ending offence. In the face of the enemy, it was disobedience. It was, in theory, punishable by death. A lesser general, a safer general, would have continued his march. He would have followed his orders to the letter, and he would have marched his 6,000 fresh soldiers directly into irrelevance, leaving his commander to be annihilated. But Louis Desaix was not a lesser general. He was 31 years old, a man of quiet, aristocratic bearing, and perhaps the only general in the French army whom Napoleon viewed as a potential rival in glory, if not in politics. He was serious, brilliant, and adored by his men, who in Egypt had nicknamed him the Just Sultan for his integrity. He was a pragmatist, a creature of battlefield instinct, not a blind follower of orders. He halted his column near the small village of Rivalta. He dismounted and he stood by his horse for long minutes, listening, just listening. The sound from the north was not fading. It was not moving south as it would if the French were advancing. It was intensifying. It was stationary. It was the sound of an army being systematically, methodically slaughtered, holding its ground and dying in place. He understood the map. He understood the first consul's fatal overconfidence from the night before. He knew with a sudden, terrible clarity that Napoleon was trapped, and he knew that his own division, these 6,000 fresh, battle-hardened soldiers, were the only uncommitted reserve in the entire theatre. They were the only hope. This was the moment that separates a good general from a great one. A great general understands intent. Napoleon's intent was to destroy Melas's army. His order to go to Novi was merely a mechanism to achieve that intent, a mechanism based on the false assumption that Melas was retreating. Now that the assumption was proven false, the order was void. Desaix made the calculation. He would not obey the letter of the law. He would obey the spirit of the war. He did not waver. He sent a single, frantic dispatch rider, an officer named Savary, to gallop north to find the first consul and to deliver a simple message. He was not asking for permission. He was announcing his action. "I have heard the cannonade. I am returning. I will be with you as soon as I can." Then he turned to his divisional commanders. "Demi-tour, à droite." About face. The march to Novi was over. The march to Marengo and into history had begun. The division turned, 6,000 men. They had already been marching for hours away from the battle. Now they had to countermarch perhaps 12 miles back to a battlefield that might already be lost by the time they arrived. The pace was punishing. The men, understanding the urgency from the very sound of the guns, felt the adrenaline surge. The march became a quick step. The quick step, in some sections, became a jog, 120 paces per minute. It was a grueling, lung-searing pace, maintained for hour after hour. As they drew closer, the signs of disaster became undeniable. The road was no longer empty. It was choked with the wreckage of their army. At first it was just the wounded stumbling back alone, their faces pale and blank with shock, holding shattered arms or pressing rags to bloody chests. They didn't even look at Desaix's men. They just kept walking like ghosts in a nightmare. Then came the caissons, the heavy ammunition wagons galloping back, their drivers whipping the horses, not stopping to explain, their faces masked with panic. Then came the first organized fleeing units, companies without officers, platoons without sergeants, men who had thrown away their heavy muskets, their packs, their shakos. They were running, they were screaming. Tout est perdu, all is lost. Sauve qui peut, save himself who can. The guard is broken, the guard is running. The men of the 9th Light Infantry, forming Desaix's advance guard, had to physically push their way through this tide of fugitives. It was a psychological battle as much as a physical one. A running man's terror is a potent poison. The fugitives grabbed at their sleeves, their eyes wide and mad. "They have 50 cannons," one shouted. "The cavalry is everywhere. You are marching to your graves." An officer from Victor's corps, his face black with powder, his uniform ripped, tried to physically stop Desaix's column. "Halt! Halt, you fools! The army is destroyed. General Bonaparte has fled." This was the moment Desaix's division could have dissolved. They were marching into a disaster that everyone else was running from. They were marching against the flow of human survival. But Desaix was there. He rode alongside his column, his face a mask of calm determination, his voice cutting through the panic. "My friends," he called out, "remember Egypt, remember the pyramids. We are the reserve. This is our battle." His presence, the presence of the just Sultan, was an anchor. His men looked at him, not at the fugitives. They tightened their grip on their muskets. They pushed their way against the tide of defeat, a solid, disciplined blue column, an island of order in an ocean of chaos, marching straight into the heart of the collapse. Sometime between 4 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon, they arrived at the village of San Giuliano. The scene was apocalyptic. Napoleon was there. He was not the demigod of the paintings. He was a small, pale man, his uniform grey with dust, his hat pulled low, surrounded by a tiny knot of shell-shocked staff officers. He was watching the last of his army, the last fragments of the consular guard, get smashed and scattered by the Austrian cavalry. His greatest marshals, Lannes and Victor, were simply trying to survive, their corps reduced to shadows. His artillery chief, Marmont, was desperately trying to save a handful of guns, but most were already abandoned, their horses hamstrung, their carriages shattered. This was not a defeat. It was a disintegration. It was the end of the army of Italy. It was the end of the consulate. He was, at that moment, a defeated general facing capture or death. He looked up and saw Desaix, a figure riding out of the chaos at the head of 5,000 fresh soldiers deploying in perfect battle order, as if they had just stepped onto a parade ground. It was a resurrection. It was a miracle. Napoleon rode to him, his hope suddenly, violently rekindled. The entire fate of France hinged on the conversation about to happen between these two men. Napoleon, still reeling, asked, "Eh bien, Général, what do you think of the state of affairs?" He was asking for a solution, for reassurance. Desaix, ever the pragmatist, was incapable of lying about a tactical situation. He looked around. He saw the Austrians now halting their pursuit, reforming into their heavy, slow victory columns. Confident, the battle was won. He looked at the retreating French rabble. He looked at his own single, small, tired division. He pulled out his pocket watch. The sources all agree on this small, human detail. He checked the time. It was late. The light was already beginning to fail. He looked at the first consul. "Yes," he said, his voice dry. "This battle is completely lost. We have retreated more than 2 leagues." We must imagine the silence, the crushing absolute finality of that statement from his last, best general. Napoleon's world ended in that second. But Desaix had not finished. He was not a man to state a problem without offering a solution. He paused, and then he spoke the words that would be carved into monuments, the words that would define his entire life and his death. But there is still time to win another. He pointed not at the retreating French, but at the advancing Austrians. We have one fresh division. If I advance now, we can catch them while they are in column, while they are disorganized by their own victory. We can stop them. If I fail, I will be killed first, and you will have your guard to cover your retreat. It was a plan of such suicidal, simple, perfect audacity that only a man like Desaix could have proposed it, and only a man like Napoleon could have understood it. Napoleon's mind, ignited by Desaix's impossible confidence, snapped back in an instant. The fog of defeat, the paralyzing, suffocating despair of the last hour, evaporated. It was burned away, replaced by the cold, clear, brilliant light of tactical geometry. He was no longer the beaten politician, the man facing disgrace in Paris, the gambler who had lost his final throw. He was the general. He was the master of the board. He saw the battlefield not as it was, a catastrophe, a ruin, the end of all his ambitions, but as it could be, an opportunity. He saw his last, desperate, final gamble, a throw of the dice so audacious, so utterly reckless, that only a man on the very brink of annihilation would dare to attempt it. And the Austrians, in their moment of supreme, arrogant triumph, were handing it to him. General von Zach, the man now leading the victorious pursuit, was a textbook soldier. He was a creature of the old school, methodical, precise, and utterly, fatally, convinced the battle was over. He had watched the French line disintegrate. He had seen the consular guard, the elite of the elite, shattered and scattered by his cavalry. He believed, with every fibre of his being, that he was merely mopping up a routed mob, a disorganized rabble of terrified conscripts. He was not conducting a combat operation in his mind. He was conducting a triumphal procession, the final act of a play whose ending was already written. So his army, his 6,000 victorious grenadiers, the very flower of the Austrian infantry, were not deployed for battle. They were not in a line of muskets, 2 ranks deep, ready to fight. They were in a dense, heavy, unwheeled Fury march column, a formation designed for pursuit, for covering ground quickly, not for combat. They were a snake, not a fortress. a long, articulated column of men, marching perhaps 24 men abreast, but stretching back for hundreds of yards. A perfect target. Their flanks were wide open, vulnerable, protected by only a handful of cavalry outriders who were themselves celebrating rather than scouting, some reportedly waving captured French equipment in triumph. Their heavy artillery was mixed into the column, limbered, useless, the horses harnessed, the cannons unready, utterly unable to deploy in time. They were blind with victory. They were deaf with pride. They were marching straight into the single greatest tactical trap of Napoleon's career. The first consul's orders, which moments before had been frantic and disjointed, now flew with purpose. They were no longer the desperate hopes of a beaten man. They were the precise, rapid-fire commands of a master architect of violence. The plan was simple. It was brutal. It was magnificent. He would stop the rout. He would form a new line, a wall of iron, and he would let the Austrians march right into it, like water into a cup. Desaix's division, the 6,000 fresh veterans from Egypt, would be the anvil. They would deploy in the open, near the small village of San Giuliano, their flank anchored on the main road. They would stand there, a defiant, impossible line of blue, in a field of chaos, and they would stop the Austrian advance cold. They were the bait. They were the sacrifice. They would have to absorb the full, concentrated momentum of Zach's entire victorious column. They would have to stand where the consular guard itself had been broken. While the anvil held, the hammer would fall. This was the key. This was the stroke of genius. Hidden from view, obscured by the thick, leafy vineyards and the low-hanging branches of the mulberry trees that lined the road, Napoleon positioned his last remaining heavy cavalry. It was not a large force. It was, in fact, terrifyingly small for the task at hand. Just 400, perhaps 500, heavy cavalry. The Gros Frères, the big brothers of the 9th Dragoons, and the 2nd and 20th Chasseurs à Cheval. These men were exhausted from the morning skirmishes, their horses lathered and blown. But they were professionals. They were under the command of the young, ambitious, and utterly fearless General François Etienne de Kellermann. Kellermann, remember that name. He was the 30-year-old son of a famous marshal, the hero of Valmy, but he was about to step out of his father's shadow and into immortality. His orders were simple: hide, stay silent, keep the horses from moving, from jingling their harness, wait for the signal, wait for the precise, singular, unmissable moment of Austrian vulnerability. And when it came, charge, charge, and do not stop. Charge as if the fate of France depended on your single squadron, because it did. But before the anvil and the hammer, Napoleon needed the spark. He needed the shock. He turned to his artillery chief, Auguste de Marmont. Marmont, like everyone else, had been in despair. His guns were lost, his crews scattered, his horses killed. He had nothing. Napoleon was clear, his voice cutting through the din. "Find me cannons. Find me every cannon. I do not care where you get them. I need a battery. Now." Marmont, galvanized by this new, terrifying energy, did the impossible. His artillerymen, his enfants as he called them, performed a logistical miracle. They scavenged the battlefield. They ran through the retreating mob, grabbing men, grabbing horses, sometimes at gunpoint. They found 5 light guns here, abandoned by Victor's corps, their crews dead or fled, but the guns still functional. They found 8 heavy guns there, saved by Lannes's rearguard, their limbers damaged, but still functional. They found the guns of the consular guard, the ones that had been overrun, but not captured, their bronze barrels gleaming in the late afternoon sun. And finally, they found Desaix's own divisional artillery, the guns that had just arrived, still hot from their forced march, their crews fresh and eager. In perhaps 20 minutes, an astonishingly short span of time, through sheer desperation, they assembled a new battery. It was not large, 18 guns by some accounts, perhaps 24 by others. It was a motley collection of different calibers, different weights. But it was all of them. It was the last of the French artillery. Marmont, a man who understood the geometry of death, wheeled these guns into position, axle to axle, a solid line of bronze, hidden by the same trees that concealed Kellermann's cavalry. They loaded them. They did not load them with solid shot, designed to punch holes in walls at a distance. They did not load them with explosive shells, designed to arc over fortifications. They loaded them with canister, bags of lead musket balls, bags of scrap iron, anything that would spray. They turned their cannons into massive, close-range shotguns, each one aimed at a single, fixed point on the road, a point where Zach's column must pass. The trap was now set. 3 elements, 3 layers of destruction, timed to perfection. 1. Marmont's massed battery, loaded with canister, aimed at a single kill zone on the road. 2. Desaix's fresh infantry division, deployed in a battle line, their bayonets fixed, ready to meet the Austrian column head-on. 3. Kellermann's heavy cavalry, hidden on the flank, their heavy sabres drawn, their horses sensing the tension, coiled like a serpent, waiting for the perfect, singular moment to strike. All Napoleon had to do was stop the rout of his own army and get them out of the way, to clear the killing field. He rode among the fugitives himself, his own uniform grey with dust, his face a mask of iron will, exposing himself to the random Austrian cannonballs that still arched across the field. He found Lannes, his face black with powder, his voice gone. He found Victor trying to hold a few hundred men together. He found the bloodied, shell-shocked remnants of the consular guard. He ordered them, he begged them, he willed them to rally, to form a new, hasty line behind Desaix's division. "Enough running, soldiers," he cried, his voice raw. "Here is your new line. Here are your comrades. Stand and fight. Stand for the honour of France." The presence of Desaix's fresh, disciplined division, standing there in perfect, unwavering lines, as if they had just stepped onto a parade ground, acted like a dam. The tide of fugitives swirled around it, slowed, and then, miraculously, stopped. The veterans, shamed by the discipline of the newcomers, began to reform. They grabbed fallen muskets. They formed hasty lines, their breath coming in ragged gasps, their faces black with powder. They were shattered. They were exhausted. But they were soldiers again. The anvil was in place. The hammer was coiled. The fuse was lit. And now, the unsuspecting Austrians marching in their dense, proud victory column, their regimental bands playing the Austrian victory march, their officers at the front, convinced they were merely chasing rabbits, walked straight toward it. General von Zach's column, 6,000 Austrian grenadiers, the very elite of the Habsburg army, marched with the steady, arrogant tramp of victors. They were no longer fighting, they were pursuing. Their regimental bands were playing the Austrian victory march, the crisp notes carrying across the plain, a triumphal announcement of their success. They were perhaps 400 yards from Desaix's silent, waiting line, a dark blue smear on the horizon that they dismissed as the last desperate remnant of a beaten foe. They saw the remnants of the French army, the survivors of Victor's and Lannes's corps, rallying behind this new, insane line of defence, and they must have scoffed. One final push, and the day was theirs. They entered the kill zone, and then the world ended. Auguste de Marmont, standing by his hidden battery, his hands steady, his eyes cold, gave the order. Fire. It was not a single cannon shot, a warning or a ranging shot. It was 18, perhaps 20, some say 24, cannons firing as one, at point-blank range, a single, unified, apocalyptic blast into the dense, packed head of the Austrian column. They did not fire solid shot, designed to punch holes in walls at a distance. They did not fire explosive shells, designed to arc over fortifications. They fired canister, they fired bags of lead musket balls, they fired scrap iron, nails, anything that would spray. It was a single, deafening, catastrophic whoosh of metal, a giant shotgun blast that vaporized the front ranks of Zach's column. It was not warfare, it was industrial slaughter. The effect was indescribable. The lead companies of the column, the first 100 men, simply ceased to exist. They were transformed in a microsecond from proud, marching soldiers into a red mist, a horrific spray of bone fragments, shredded white uniforms, and pulverized flesh. The men immediately behind them were struck by the wave of metal, falling in heaps, screaming, clutching at wounds that had not existed a second before. The victory march stopped. The music stopped. The drums went silent. The triumphant advance dissolved into a stationary, screaming mob of terrified, confused men, their ears ringing from a concussion that felt like the sky had split open, their eyes blinded by the sulphurous yellow smoke that suddenly choked the air. They were trapped, packed shoulder to shoulder, unable to advance, unable to retreat, unable to deploy. They were a perfect target. Before the Austrians could even comprehend the artillery strike, before their officers could scream an order, before they could reform their shattered ranks, Desaix gave his own command. The 9th Light Infantry, the incomparable as they were known, did not wait. They did not fire a volley. That was for the old battle, the one that had been lost. This was a new battle, a battle of the bayonet. They fixed steel and they charged, screaming, a wave of pure, vengeful fury, surging forward out of their own smoke, directly into the face of the stunned Austrian column. Desaix himself, true to his word, led from the front. He was on horseback, his sword raised, shouting encouragement to his men, a beacon of aristocratic disdain for death. He was the most visible target. As the 9th surged forward, a single Austrian musket ball, perhaps a random shot from the smoke, perhaps aimed by a marksman, struck him squarely in the chest. He pitched forward from his horse. He was dead before he hit the ground. He was 31 years old. The man who had saved the army, the just Sultan of Egypt, was gone. His last words, supposedly whispered to his aide-de-camp, were, "Go. Tell the first consul that I die with the regret of not having done enough to live in posterity." But his men, in the chaos and the smoke, did not see him fall. They were already moving, a wave of blue crashing into the stunned white-coated Austrian line. The fighting became a savage, point-blank melee. Bayonets, rifle butts, fists. The fresh French infantry, fueled by adrenaline and the desperate energy of a last chance, tore into the head of the Austrian column, which was still reeling from Marmont's canister blast. But the Austrians were not conscripts. They were veterans. Their own cavalry, the Liechtenstein dragoons, seeing the French infantry exposed as they charged, reacted with professional speed. They countercharged, a heavy mass of horsemen slamming into the flank of the 9th Light. Desaix's infantry staggered, forced to halt their advance, turning to form hasty squares to repel the horsemen. The counterattack was stalling. The momentum was being lost. The battle hung, for one last agonizing second, on a knife's edge. And this was the moment. This was the opening. François Etienne de Kellermann, hidden in the vineyards, had been watching this entire exchange with the predatory stillness of a coiled snake. He was not watching Desaix. He was not watching Marmont. He was watching the flank of Zach's main infantry column. In that moment of chaos, as the Austrian infantry wavered from the canister, As their own cavalry charged forward to hit Desaix, they had done one fatal, unforgivable thing. They had exposed their entire left side. It was a vast, undefended flank of thousands of men, packed shoulder to shoulder, completely blind to the threat lurking in the trees just 50 yards away. Kellermann did not wait for an order from Napoleon. Historians still debate this, but the evidence, the timing, the sheer audacity of it suggests this was his decision alone. He was a man who understood in that microsecond that history is not made by those who wait for permission. He turned to his 400, perhaps 500, heavy cavalrymen, the gros frères, the big brothers. He raised his heavy sabre. He screamed the one word that mattered, charge. It was not a charge, it was an eruption. 400 heavy cavalry, men on massive horses, wearing steel helmets and breastplates that made them look like medieval knights, burst from the line of mulberry trees at a full, thundering, earth-shaking gallop. They were not charging a line, they were charging a column. They did not hit the front, which was still engaged with Desaix's men. They hit the flank, the soft, undefended, 900-yard-long side of the Austrian formation. The impact was absolute. It was the tactical equivalent of a broadside from a ship of the line hitting a canoe. The heavy French horses, moving at 30 miles an hour, weighing over 1,000 pounds each, smashed into the packed ranks of Austrian grenadiers with the force of a battering ram. The first rank of Austrians simply vanished, trampled underfoot, shattered by the sheer kinetic energy. The second, third, and fourth ranks, unable to see the threat, unable to deploy, unable to even lift their muskets, were cut down by the long, heavy sabres of the cuirassiers. The charge did not stop. It penetrated. Kellermann's 400 men tore through the column, splitting it in two, then wheeling inside it, in the very heart of the Austrian formation, and charging down its length. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The 6,000 grenadiers, the victors of the day, dissolved. Panic, a force more powerful than any cannon, took over. Men who had stood firm against infantry for hours now faced their primal terror. Heavy cavalry, inside their formation, cutting them down from behind. They threw down their muskets. They tore off their heavy packs. They fell to their knees, begging for quarter, holding their hands up in the smoke-filled air. Officers tried to rally them, only to be cut down by Kellermann's men, who were now riding rampant through the disorganized mob. The entire column, the elite of the Austrian army, collapsed in on itself. It became a cauldron of terror. In the center of this chaos, General von Zach himself, the man who had been writing his victory dispatch in his head just minutes before, found himself face to face with the French cuirassier. He was surrounded. He was weaponless. He was beaten. He surrendered his sword on the spot. With their general gone, the column ceased to be an army at all. It became a stampede. Thousands of men, perhaps 2,000, perhaps as many as 4,000, were taken prisoner in a chaotic swirl that lasted no more than 15 or 20 minutes. The rest fled, running back toward the Bormida River, back toward Alessandria, pursued by the French, who were no longer the defeated, but the victors. The Battle of Marengo was not just saved, it was won. It was won by the suicidal charge of 6,000 infantrymen, and it was consummated by the impossible, perfectly timed charge of 400 cavalrymen. The sun set on a scene from hell. The Austrian army, which at 3 o'clock that afternoon had been the undisputed, professional, and methodical master of the field, was now a shattered, incoherent rabble. It was a total collapse. They were streaming in panicked thousands back toward the Bormida River, abandoning weapons, cannons, and all semblance of discipline. Kellermann's heavy cavalry, joined now by the rallied infantry of Lannes and Victor, who tasted vengeance after a full day of humiliation, pursued them relentlessly into the twilight. The sabres, which had been held in reserve for so long, now rose and fell, turning the Austrian retreat into a comprehensive slaughter. The plain was choked with the wreckage of their army. The Austrian losses were staggering, almost impossible to comprehend, for an army that had, just hours before, completely won the battle. The numbers are still debated by historians, clouded by the chaos of the final rout, but reliable estimates suggest that in those few hours the Austrians lost perhaps 6,000, maybe 7,000, men killed or wounded. Even more devastatingly, 8,000 men were prisoners of war. General von Zach himself, the man who had confidently led the pursuit, was a captive. 40 cannons, the pride of the Austrian artillery park, were now in French hands. The French had paid a terrible, terrible price for this victory. Their own losses were agonizingly high, perhaps 4,000, perhaps as high as 7,000 men killed or wounded, a devastating percentage of the forces that had actually fought. But the result was absolute. The following day, June 15th, Baron von Melas sat at the negotiating table. He was a broken man. His magnificent army, the force that had conquered Italy, was trapped, demoralized, and functionally destroyed. He had no choice. He signed the Convention of Alessandria. With a few strokes of a pen, he agreed to surrender every single Austrian fortress in northern Italy west of the Mincio River. He agreed to withdraw the shattered remnants of his army back to Austria. In a single, brutal, 12-hour span, Napoleon had regained everything France had spent an entire year losing. It was one of the most decisive strategic reversals in modern history. Yet for Napoleon Bonaparte, the victory was ashes in his mouth. In the gathering darkness, as the surgeons' lanterns began to move across the fields of corpses like mournful spirits, he searched not for his captured cannons, not for his captured generals, but for the one man who had made it possible. He found him. General Louis Desaix was lying where he had fallen, shot clean through the heart at the very beginning of his final, sacrificial charge. The hero of the day, the man who had reversed his orders, the man who had defied fate, had not lived to see his victory. The first consul, the master of Europe, knelt in the mud by the body of his friend. This was the true, unbearable cost of Marengo. The loss of Desaix was, in Napoleon's own words, irreparable. He later, perhaps apocryphally, turned to his staff, his face, for once, stripped of its iron mask, and asked the question that defined the day: "Why am I not permitted to weep?" Napoleon returned to Paris not just as a victor, but as the architect of a miracle. The news of the victory, arriving after initial rumours of a catastrophic defeat, electrified the capital. It secured his political position. It silenced his critics. It made him unassailable. But the first consul understood the messy, chaotic, desperate reality of what had happened on that plain. He knew that the battle had been lost at 3 o'clock. He knew it had been saved, not by his grand design, but by the desperate initiative of two subordinates. One of them, Louis Desaix, was conveniently dead. He could be safely transformed into a glorious martyr, the embodiment of French sacrifice, his memory forever tied to his commander's cause. But the other, François-Étienne Kellermann, was very much alive. Kellermann had performed the decisive act of the day. His 400-man charge was the single pivot point that turned annihilation into total victory. And he knew it. This made him dangerous. Napoleon praised Kellermann publicly, but privately the general was marginalized. He was promoted, yes, but never again would he be given the chance for such independent, battle-winning glory. The first consul could not, and would not, share the stage. The myth of Marengo had to be constructed, and it had to be constructed around one man. So the official bulletins, the histories, the paintings, they were adjusted. The morning's route was rewritten, smoothed over, transformed into a strategic withdrawal. Desaix's arrival was presented not as a desperate last-minute reinforcement, but as the planned arrival of the reserve. And Kellermann's charge? In the official narrative, it was Napoleon himself who, with unmatched genius, saw the precise second of opportunity and personally dispatched his heavy cavalry to deliver the killing blow. The truth was buried beneath the legend. Marengo became the founding victory of the French Empire. The battle that had been lost at 3 o'clock and won at 5:30 became the unblemished proof of Bonaparte's destiny. It gave him the political capital he needed to consolidate his power, to become consul for life in 1802, and finally to place the imperial crown upon his own head in 1804. The chaos, the panic, the desperation of the actual day, all of it was washed away, replaced by the heroic image of a single man controlling the storm. The victory, won by the blood of 6,000 Frenchmen and the impulsive genius of his generals, was claimed by him, and by him alone,